The History of Poland, Episode 25, Pomerania, Part 3. Hello and welcome back. The assimilation of an entire people group into another people group is not as simple as pouring one cup of water into another. If you have a group of people who are defined by something like their ethnicity, race, religion, nationality, or some other characteristic, it's not an automatic process to combine them with a different group of people that don't share those defining elements. For me, what I think about is a sort of spectrum, with forced assimilation on one end and voluntary assimilation on the other end. On one end, I think of something like the popular idea of the American melting pot and how, for example, German immigrants assimilated into the larger American identity. Even though people came to the United States voluntarily, there wasn't an immediate shift in the language, religion, or customs to match the people around them. Germans continued to speak German. Irish continued to have an accent. Food was different. There were regional differences. That was voluntary assimilation, and it was slow and steady, but even though it was voluntary, it wasn't automatic. Then on the other end, you have some of the forced assimilations that we know about throughout history, where one group of people wants to force another group of people to become just like them, or else. With that last part, time to reaching for a sword hilt. In these situations, it's not surprising that the shift in language, religion, customs, etc. isn't automatic either. I bring up all of this because assimilation is not automatic, whether it's voluntary or not. And when it's not voluntary, when it's a forced assimilation using coercive diplomacy or violent threats, that assimilation happens in fits and starts. That's what happens with Pomerania. In our last episode, we ended with Gallus telling us that the siege of Nakvo had ended and Bolesław had conquered the city and the surrounding Pomeranian regions. Not just as vassal states, but as full-fledged parts of the Polish realm. One of the side effects of Bolesław's conquering of these regions of Pomerania is that he now effectively controls the Notech River basin. This means that access through the swamplands gets marginally easier for the Poles, and that access to the sea is partially simplified, though that access is not guaranteed. That could be the end of Bolesław's interest in Pomerania, but this is the beginning of the episode, and we all know that's not going to be the case. After all, Bolesław is not someone who sits back and rests on his laurels. Following the siege of Nakvo, Bolesław fought a long, prolonged war in Pomerania, sometimes victorious and sometimes not. But over the course of years, he scratched and clawed until he controlled much of the territory. As Mantefel tells us, quote, "The period between 1113 and 1123 saw a bitter struggle for control of Pomerania. The Polish attack was directed against the eastern part, and the sole account of these wars gives only a single detail, that 2 cities were taken in the year 1116. This probably occurred during the final phase of the annexation of the Vistula basin of Pomerania, because entries for the year 1119 already pertain to battles in the western part of Pomerania." End quote. And that's pretty much what we know about that stretch of years. It's a short summary, it's accurate, but it's also a bit disappointing in its brevity. In that 10-year period, lives were lost and saved, fortunes were stolen and amassed, cultures were threatened and bolstered, and the lives of everyday men and women were upended. Not to go too far off track, but it's one of the aspects of studying history that most disappoints me. I mean, we're all familiar with Stalin's adage about tragedy and statistics, but we often forget to apply it to the callousness of time. 10 years passed, and we're on to the next thing that Bolesław did without pausing to consider the tragedy, or lack of tragedy, since we don't have all the details, of that decade. But we can't wallow around bemoaning the lack of hard data for too long, since time does march on, and it marches us right into the next stage of the Pomeranian conquest. That stage? A rebellion. Yes, another rebellion. But unlike the stubborn refusal that we witnessed in Nakvo, this rebellion is a bit more serious. As referenced in a number of previous episodes, there was a Polish noble named Scarpa Mir. This nobleman was a key player in the life of Bolesław. If we recall the early days of Bolesław's life, when he was in conflict with his dear old dad and with Sieciech, there was a moment when Bolesław was elevated to one of his earliest positions of authority. At that time, he had a tutor who played a role in that elevation, whose name was Scarpa Mir. Scarpa Mir was alongside Bolesław as he rose in power, as he fought against Zbigniew, as he went on campaigns, and when Bolesław needed someone he could trust in to do something while he was busy, Scarpa Mir was often the noble he turned to. It's hard to know exactly how to describe Bolesław and Scarpa Mir's relationship, other than that he was Bolesław's Count Palatine. I end up thinking about this in 2 different ways. The first is that he served as a sort of father figure for Boleslav, since Władysław was a pretty terrible dad by any measure I can think of. The second way is that he was sort of a chaperone watching over Boleslav, guiding him and making sure he didn't go the wrong way. That's not anywhere in the historical record, but at the very least Scarpa Mir seemed kind of like a close uncle, I guess. That is, until he rebelled. Like with Bolesław's actions in Pomerania, it doesn't seem like anyone is quite sure why Scarpa Mir rebelled. But one hint can come to us from Scarpa Mir's actual family connections. That's right, aside from his relationship to Bolesław and being the Count Palatine of Poland, he did have a life. Specifically, he was one of the leaders, if not the leader, of the Awdania clan, one of the leading nobles of Piast, Poland. From his position as the leader of the clan, Scarpa Mir would have had a unique vantage point of what's been going on in Poland. For the last few episodes, it seemed like Bolesław was doing great, Poland was thriving, and that things were on an upward trajectory. Yet that's not really the full picture. To take a step back, in political science, one of the basic ideas is that there are a few ways to analyze nation-state behavior, each at a different level of focus. To radically oversimplify things, there's the system level of analysis, where you look at how nations interact with each other through the lens of how the system is set up. Then there's the state level, where you can say that events happen because a state is in need of a resource, feels wronged, is particularly warlike, etc. Then, moving down another level, you have the organizational level, which is how the different actors inside of an individual state all push and pull the state in a direction. So whereas the state level would be, say, can you believe Germany did such and such? On the organizational level, you can say, oh, there are 4 political parties inside of Germany, and they're doing this and this and this, and it's all pushing and pulling the state in a different direction. Then you have the individual level below that, where you can say that a nation did something because their monarch felt they needed to act based on personal beliefs. Monarch, ruler, whatever the leader is. Anyway, that's really oversimplified, and if you want to learn more, take a political science class. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is that we haven't talked about the organizational level in a little bit. To make the story a bit easier to understand, I've been acting as if Bolesław was just deciding things on his own, but that's not really the case. No, while it's true that Bolesław was the ruler of Poland, he wasn't an absolute dictator. His word wasn't automatically law, nor did he have 3 independent branches of secret police reporting to him on the doings of everyone who followed his orders. No, Bolesław had to consider the opinions of other people. While there wasn't an organized parliament, there were nobles and families that held power in Poland that dated back just as long as the PS claimed to supremacy. Which brings us back to Scarpa Mir. He was certainly involved in all the goings-on with Bolesław's foreign policy. At the very least, he participated in campaigns against Bohemia and Pomerania. But that does not mean he was 100% walking lockstep with the Duke. He had his own loyalties, and like many people, family came first. At least that's what we think. Again, there aren't a ton of sources. So let's take a look at recent events, and instead of looking through the eyes of Bolesław, let's look through the eyes of Scarpa Mir for a moment. Not to recap everything, but just to look at the highlights. And it's almost needless to say this is very speculative, since it's not like we have Scarpa Mir's first-hand account written in a diary. As nice as that would be. If there is some distant relation of his hanging on to a copy of this fictional diary, now is the time. To start, we have Bolesław's long war with Zbigniew. As one of the chief men of Bolesław's court, Scarpa Mir would have been involved in much of the planning relating to these hostilities. And with one of Bolesław's clear aims having been the consolidation of power under his own rule, it's very likely that Scarpa Mir saw that in a favorable light. It would have meant his overlord was essentially without rival in Poland, and after all, it's better to be the number 2 man to the number 1 man than the number 2 man in just half the country. Second, we have Bolesław's wars with Bohemia and with the Empire. These would have been seen as great opportunities for Scarpa Mir. As we saw in Gallus's recordings, Scarpa Mir was involved in raids in Bohemia and in the war with the Empire, acting on Bolesław's behalf and indeed in his stead at times when he was called away. The advantage to Scarpa Mir was clear here. He would have had plenty of opportunity to plunder, and, if successful in his military career, could rightly have expected rewards to be doled out by Bolesław. Finally, we have Bolesław's actions in Pomerania. Bolesław was on the warpath yet again, and there would have been just as much opportunity for advancement as before for a noble like Scarpa Mir, but, just a little bit less opportunity. After all, by this point, the hostilities with Bohemia and the Empire were on the back burner, and this wasn't a raid into Pomerania, but the conquest of it. Which is fine, but the opportunities for Scarpa Mir to make his fortune was possibly diminishing slightly. I bring up this series of events because it paints a couple different trajectories. One is that Scarpa Mir starts off getting wealthy with his horse hitched to the right piast, but that increase in wealth is slowing down. The second is that Bolesław is more and more unchecked in his power. For nobles like Scarpa Mir, who value their autonomy, a key theme throughout this time in Polish history, it may have sent up a few red flags. On the whole, you could see these events as a trend of centralizing authority, which by nature meant a noble like Scarpa Mir losing authority. I mean, we've seen noble resistance against central authority before in Polish history, and believe you me, we're going to see it again. On the whole, it could have just been a situation where the benefits just didn't seem as beneficial anymore, and the costs seemed to be a little bit higher than they were at the beginning. We don't know the details of the rebellion, aside from the fact that it was led by Scarpa Mir and that it took place in 1117. Manteuffel gives a concise summary, saying, quote, "Perhaps it was related to the struggle of the magnates against the growing power of the prince. The revolt was bloodily suppressed, and despite all his previous services, Scarpa Mir was blinded as a traitor." End quote. Yes, like Zbigniew before him, Scarpa Mir was blinded. Though this time around, there was no long road to penance. Now, just one quick side note on the issue of Scarpa Mir that I need to highlight. As I mentioned previously, Gallus's account has ended, and it ended shortly before these events took place. The reason behind this appears to have been that Gallus was employed as a scribe either by Scarpa Mir himself or by his family, at least that's the speculation of many historians. Either way, his benefactor was now on the losing side of the conflict with Bolesław, and it appears to have meant the end of Gallus's account. It could have been that Gallus left Poland, or that he wasn't going to work for free, or that something else in the revolt ended his account. Maybe his death, we don't know. For all we know, he died during the bloody suppression of the revolt. We just don't know. What we do know is that our time with Gallus is officially at an end. Thank you for your services, Gallus. Exit stage left. After the revolt, the long road once again wound northwards to Pomerania, after a brief detour through the Kievan Rus. I won't bore you with the details, since, to be honest, there's only so many times I can talk about Bolesław intervening in the decision-making of which brother or cousin ends up on the throne for 2 years in a neighboring land. I mean, really, there's only so many times. I mean, yet technically it matters, but on another deeper level, does it really matter? Not to this podcaster, at least not when we're talking about Pomerania. So, Bolesław is headed back into Pomerania after having completed his conquest of eastern Pomerania. This time, he's focused on the western half of Pomerania. Surprise! This conquest wasn't without resistance, but it did go pretty well, all things considered. Over the course of 3 years, Bolesław folded the territories of western Pomerania into Poland proper. As Manteuffel tells us, quote, "Bolesław had no intention of desisting after regaining eastern Pomerania, rather proceeding with a plan to occupy the long independent territories along the lower Oder and Percenta. The war in these areas was all the more difficult because the pagan Pomeranians not only were fighting for their political freedom, but were fiercely opposed to any attempts to Christianize them. In the course of several campaigns between 1119 and 1123, even the most fortified centers fell. Szczecin was taken in the winter when deep freezes permitted access to the city along its surrounding waterways. Bolesław also finally took the islands of Uznam and Wolin. That was the order of events in the conquest of Pomerania, but Bolesław treated the occupied territories in various ways. The area along the Nociak was annexed in its entirety to Wielopolska, and Polish governors ruled in the area of the Vistula basin of Pomerania, though they had been recruited from local dynasties. But western Pomerania continued to be ruled by its reigning prince, Warcisław, who acknowledged Polish suzerainty. He was obligated to provide military troops for Bolesław's campaigns, pay an annual tribute, and convert to Christianity. Bolesław placed special emphasis on this last condition because he realized that church ties between a converted Pomerania and the Gniezno metropolitan would strengthen the bonds between the two states. The missionary effort faced serious problems, however, because of a lack of priests within the Polish episcopate capable of undertaking such a project. Bolesław was compelled to seek help elsewhere. End quote. That cliffhanger Manteuffel gives us there leads into a most fascinating character, that help elsewhere character. That person is Otto of Bamberg, the focus of our next episode. As always, thank you for listening. If you'd like to help support the creation of this podcast, you can donate at patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast, or you can go to the website, thehistoryofpolandpodcast.com, and click on support the show. If you can't spare the change, you can always leave a review on the various podcast apps or follow along on social media by searching for the History of Poland podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.